ever participated in the die-rolling ritual of Dungeons and Dragons, you're no stranger to battling imaginary monsters. While the game has always been played with pencil and paper, it can now be played in the form of a fantasy video game. Yesterday, I sat down with Jeff Anderson, CEO of Turbine, the company that makes Dungeons and Dragons Online Stormreach.
Thank you.
Oh,
holy shit.
Bye-bye.
There it goes.
Wow.
Right in the middle.
Whoa.
Let's go,
No.
boys. Great job,
Go.
guys.
There you go.
Waitress! I've been needing some service over here.
I served in the last war.
We know. You won't shut up about it.
I am a Zorian. Zorite. Zoriation. I'm from Zoriat, and I hate you.
Welcome to Philanus.
We are the hated. Don't welcome me. Hate me. Don't you read the forums?
In a surprising turn of events, Turbine Entertainment files a $30 million lawsuit against its own publisher, Atari, only 3 weeks before DDO goes free to play.
And I would basically just go home and sob every night. Because, DDO was, these were my babies. Like, when you're the community manager, these are your babies. And your babies are in pain, and there's nothing you could do about it.
Sometimes they want to stab you.
Sometimes they want to stab you, but that's true of children, too.
Conclude the ghost flame story. We do fight the hand! Did I see something? You saw something, baby! We got it! We figured it out! It's finally solved!
Oh yeah, guacamole. How do you make the UI bigger? Oh, legendary John Dungeon of Dragons.
Oh, he's typing.
Oh, he's typing. You
That's
It's been 19 years.
I'll trust you, game. I'm ready to read. Teach me your ways. Make me the best new player you can make me. So I click that link. Stunning. Just an absolutely stunning start. The new player guide link does not work.
Most MMORPGs from 2006 are long gone. Studios closed, servers went dark, and the next big things were forgotten within a few years. But Dungeons & Dragons Online, DDO, is still here. It's a dense, complex MMORPG based on the classic Dungeons & Dragons tabletop game. Most people have never even heard of DDO, yet it's one of the longest-running MMORPGs in history. Many believed it was too niche, or had too many bugs to survive. And yet, 20 years later, the game is still alive. Behind the legacy we see today is a history of massive gambles and sacrifices that almost nobody remembers anymore. Against all odds, DDO endured. This is the story of Turbine Entertainment Software, and the impossible birth of Dungeons & Dragons Online. The early 2000s, gaming was at its all-time peak. It was a fun and exciting era and a true renaissance for video games, with timeless classics being released every single month. With the internet going broadband and suddenly millions of homes getting access to stable, high-speed internet connection, the stars aligned for a new genre of games to soon take the world by storm: the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, featuring consistent online worlds where thousands of players would play together. They were extremely ambitious for the time, but they were also a huge gamble. These games were incredibly expensive to make, requiring constant updates and millions of dollars in server costs, while a single bad update could mean losing thousands of subscribers overnight. As such, they were virtually impossible to make without a huge corporate backing them, and even then, most would fail. By 2002, the MMORPG scene was dominated by three titans. The undisputed king was EverQuest, the first theme park MMO. It established the rules we know: tanks, healers, raiding, leveling systems. The game was very successful, and it was dubbed as Evercrack for how addictive it was. It was very innovative, and it was raking in a lot of money for Sony. EverQuest basically defined what a modern 3D MMO should look like in the 21st century. But they were not alone. In second place, there was Ultima Online, the first sandbox MMO. It was an experimental world of absolute freedom. Players were the government, the merchants, the bankers. You could spend months building your own house, only to have a higher level character killing you and stealing all your possessions. It was definitely the most hardcore of the classic MMOs. And then, in third place, there was the underdog, Asheron's Call. While EverQuest broke the world into small zones with loading screens, Asheron's Call did the impossible. It introduced a huge, seamless world. No loading screens. You could run on for hours without ever stopping, something that was revolutionary for the time. It also was the first without rigid classes, and instead opting for a complex skill-based progression system. Asheron's Call's deep character customization was ahead of any other MMO at the time. No two characters were the same. The studio behind it? Turbine Entertainment, based out of Massachusetts. Turbine was not a corporate giant. It started with a group of friends from Brown University who ran the company in the founder's parents' living room because they couldn't afford an office. Interestingly, the company started out with $30,000 the founder received from an insurance claim after he was hit by a car. By the early 2000s, they had grown to a team of about 30 people, led by their CEO, Jeffrey Anderson. Jeffrey was an industry veteran, having previously been an executive at Electronic Arts, overseeing Ultima Online. He knew very well the challenge that Turbine was up against, competing against two icons of the era. He knew that competing against EverQuest in Ultima Online was not going to be easy for a small studio. Despite having a much smaller team with fewer resources, Turbine had been successful in the beginning years of Asheron's Call. The game was developed by Turbine, but the servers and the marketing were controlled by their publisher, Microsoft. And that was the problem. Despite being a successful studio, Turbine was basically operating in the shadow of Microsoft. They were the hired help. They built the world, but they didn't own it. But Jeffrey had much bigger ambitions for Turbine. He did not want his company to be one of Microsoft's many studios for hire forever. He knew of Microsoft's history of shutting down video game studios when things don't go as expected. Also, around this time, Microsoft was very busy with bigger projects: the Xbox, Windows XP, MSN Messenger, .NET, and others. As such, MMORPGs were no more than a side experiment for them. But Jeffrey knew that the MMORPG market would change the gaming industry, and he believed that Turbine had the talent to rise above the giants and conquer it. In a 2003 interview, Jeffrey said, "There is no question in my mind that Turbine will continue to build the future of online gaming." But time was running out. Asheron's Call was a hit when it released in 1999, but by 2003, it was fading quickly. Its subscriber numbers were being dwarfed by EverQuest and challenged by newer, faster games like Dark Age of Camelot. Microsoft, the publisher, saw the writing on the wall. They didn't want a cult classic. They wanted a market leader. Microsoft met with Jeffrey and demanded him to make a blockbuster sequel. Jeffrey was astonished. A sequel to Asheron's Call? After only 3 years since launch? Nobody else in the MMO market had done this before. He knew this was a very risky move, but as Turbine could not live on without Microsoft, he had to agree. What he didn't know is that worst was still to come. Microsoft told Jeffrey they wanted to chase the mass market. They demanded Turbine simplify everything and abandon the unique, classless depth that made their first game successful and loved by fans. Jeffrey realized the truth. Microsoft wanted to strip the soul of the franchise and make Asheron's Call 2 to be another EverQuest clone. Turbine got to work. For months, the studio operated under constant pressure. They poured every dollar and every waking hour into Asheron's Call 2. It was a massive gamble. They had to painstakingly dismantle every single system that made Turbine's franchise unique. No more skill-based character progression, no more factions, no more character uniqueness, no more open-world PvP, and much more. They significantly improved the graphics, but they were hollowing the soul of the game. And deep down, Jeffrey and everyone at Turbine knew they were betraying the fans who had supported them all these years and the very people who put them on the map. And yet, they were forced to continue, hoping for the best, but fearing the worst. November 2002, launch day. On the surface, AC2 looked like the future. The graphics and the world design were stunning, years ahead of EverQuest and Ultima Online. But the moment players logged in, their dream collapsed into a nightmare. By this time, MMO players were no strangers to rocky launches, but AC2's launch was something else. It was completely broken on arrival. And the culprit wasn't Turbine's code, it was their Microsoft's infrastructure not working. Microsoft, responsible for the back-end servers, did not put enough resources for the game's launch, and many systems were completely dead. The biggest problem? Communication. For months, the game's chat system did not work. In a genre defined by social interaction, Asheron's Call 2 was completely silent. Players had no way to communicate with each other. Also, it was very clear the game was released unfinished. Outside of the initial starting zones, the world was empty, lacking quests or any engaging content. Towns were hollow, full of unenterable buildings and barely any NPCs. Compared to the massive, rich world of Asheron's Call 1, the sequel felt like a half-finished demo. To make matters worse, the game was poorly optimized. Having some of the best graphics in the MMO market of the time, AC2 was simply too much for most consumer PCs in 2002, leading to terrible performance, constant crashes, and huge server lag. But besides all its bugs, its biggest problem was doing a 180 shift from what fans were hoping for. Killing the feeling of freedom that made Asheron's Call 1 so special, replacing it with a simplified theme park that had nothing new to offer beyond what EverQuest did. The result was devastating. Critics and players alike demolished the game for being generic, shallow, and lacking any creativity. And only weeks after its release, the game had only a fraction of the players AC1 had. Jeffrey was crushed. The project they had spent millions of dollars in and countless hours on, that was supposed to launch Turbine into the stratosphere, had become one of the biggest flops in MMO history at the time. With all resources spent, Asheron's Call 2 forced Turbine into massive layoffs, and it was dragging the entire studio toward bankruptcy. The dream of breaking free seemed dead. Turbine wasn't breaking chains anymore, they were drowning in them. December 2002. Jeffrey was spending his nights walking around their Boston office, thinking about what to do. The aftermath of Asheron's Call 2 was brutal on him and the team. Turbine had played by the rules. They did exactly what Microsoft wanted. They dumbed down the game's mechanics, they chased the trends, and what was their reward? A failed game, a fractured community, and a decimated team. And now the company was weeks away from closing its doors. Jeffrey knew for a long time that Turbine's partnership with Microsoft was a death trap. As long as Turbine wasn't an independent studio, the company would never be safe. Microsoft had no real interest in making a truly special game, and they would have no issue in pulling the plug when necessary. The only way out was ownership. The IP, the product, the revenue, all of it. In that desperate moment, Jeffrey made the most crucial decision of his career. 3 moves, simultaneously. No room for failure. Number 1, a new game, a major license. Something so big that investors could not ignore. Number 2, raise the money needed to develop the game and buy back their freedom. Number 3, buy back the Asheron's Call franchise and cut ties with Microsoft forever. Turbine would have to become the first truly independent AAA MMORPG studio, launching a new game based on a world-renowned IP. Jeffrey decided this was the point of no return for Turbine. This was their last chance. Turbine must own their destiny. They would launch a new game, but a famous IP wasn't enough. They needed an insurance policy. They needed a brand so powerful, so undeniable, that came in with a built-in army of millions of fans before a single line of code was written. It was obvious. Every MMO on the market was borrowing from the same source, a copy of a copy. They were all high fantasy. Turbine would not make another copy. They would buy the original. Dungeons and Dragons. This wasn't just a game. It was the DNA of the entire industry. Hit points, levels, stats, critical hits. D&D invented the language that EverQuest and every other RPG spoke. If Turbine could secure this license, they wouldn't just be making another RPG. They would be digitizing the Bible of the RPG genre. It was the only way. But buying the original wasn't simple at all. Hasbro owned Wizards of the Coast, who owned Dungeons and Dragons. But the exclusive rights to create and publish D&D video games were owned by Atari. That meant Jeffrey didn't have one negotiation in front of him. He had 3. This was the Iron Triangle, and there was no way around it, only through. The plan was set. Jeffrey had gone into the D&D negotiation wanting total independence, full publishing rights. He had just spent 5 years watching what happened when someone else had power over his own game. He wasn't going to do it again. What he came out with was different. Turbine would develop and run the game and own the subscriptions. Atari would own the retail sales, a co-publishing agreement. Wizards of the Coast would hold content approval rights over everything. Every expansion, every story, every mechanical change that touched D&D rules. It wasn't the deal he'd wanted. Atari's name would be on the box. He compromised. But Turbine would control the game itself, and that was the part that mattered. And so, in May 15th, 2003, Atari and Turbine revealed their next game, Dungeons and Dragons Online. A near-bankrupt studio had somehow secured the most iconic IP in RPG history. Now they just needed the money to build it. But in 2003, raising venture capital money for an MMORPG was extremely rare, as the funding typically came from big corporations. The dot-com bubble had wiped out fortunes 2 years earlier. Turbine was also a studio that had just shipped one of the most publicized MMO failures in recent memory. That didn't help. But Turbine had in their hands the most powerful IP in the genre. In the end, Jeffrey was right. The funding was inevitable. In December, Turbine announced they raised $18 million from Highland and Polaris, 2 VC investors from Silicon Valley. Turbine called it a total shift in our business model, taking out the middleman between us and our fans. Turbine's funding round was heard all over the world. At the time, it was one of the largest venture funding rounds in the history of online gaming. But they were not done. Next, it was time to break free from Microsoft. The pitch was obvious. Microsoft's future was in the Xbox, in the living room. They knew it very well. In their eyes, spending time and resources in a fading MMO was nothing but a distraction. Jeffrey offered a clean exit, a lump sum of money for the entire franchise. They took it. The terms were never publicly disclosed, but both parties were happy to break apart. Jeffrey said now is a terrific opportunity to bring the franchise home again. Turbine, without a doubt, wouldn't be here without the support of Microsoft. Microsoft's representative said the deal would let Turbine exercise complete control over Asheron's Call, enabling and empowering them to move forward in the direction they want. And so, by the end of the year, Turbine was the most talked about name in the MMO space. Jeffrey had done the impossible. They had the money, they had the rights. Now, it was finally time to build DDO. The game was on. Turbine had the license, they had the money. Now they had to decide what kind of game they were actually building. Every MMO on the market at the time was the same game wearing different clothes. A massive shared world, thousands of strangers, one loop repeated forever. Find enemy, click enemy, press button, wait, watch animation, repeat. The entire genre was chasing the same idea. Turbine looked at all of it. Then they went the other way. The first decision? No open world. In every MMO, your dungeon was everyone's dungeon. You'd walk in for a story and find dozens of players already there, farming the same enemies, breaking the immersion. Real D&D was a private experience, a small group, a controlled space, a story that only existed for the people playing it. So Turbine made the call. Every dungeon would be private. Your group, your instance, your version of that space. Your party goes in, and the world outside disappears. The second decision, make combat fun. MMOs were built on distance. Point, click, wait, let the server resolve it. Turbine wanted players inside the fight, swinging, blocking, moving, reacting. In 2004, for an MMO, that was a gamble. Nobody knew if it would feel right. Nobody knew if it would even work. The third decision, no PvP. Dungeons & Dragons was built around a group working together against the dungeon. And the moment you add PvP, that structure starts to break. D&D is, at its core, a PvE game. Also, if they added PvP, that means every class, every spell, every item now has to be balanced for two completely different games, cooperation and competition, at the same time for decades to come. Turbine didn't want to split the game in half, so they cut it clean. No PvP, one system, one focus. A party against the dungeon, the way D&D had always been played. The fourth decision, a structured, guided gameplay. Many MMOs at the time were sandboxes, systems layered together, players left to find their own path inside a huge world without any direction. Complete freedom, but not intuitive. Dungeons & Dragons was different. It was guided. A dungeon master leading a group through a crafted experience, step by step. Turbine wasn't building a sandbox. They were building adventures. Controlled, directed, narrated, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. 4 decisions, each one a bet that players wanted something different. And now came the part where most ideas die. Execution. Turbine had set forward their plans for DDO. Now they had until summer to show a playable demo. This would have to include working core mechanics, monsters, weapons, all in a proper test dungeon. This would be a monumental sprint. Production-wise, Turbine had the advantage that they could use much of the same technology they had built for AC2 to build DDO. As Turbine founder Johnny Montserrat said, that was one of their biggest strengths. It would allow them to develop the game much faster and more efficiently than their competitors. Building a brand new MMORPG engine from scratch with such demanding deadlines from investors and from Atari would be impossible. But of course, they still had to modify their engine for DDO. There were 3 main adaptations. First, AC2's engine was built for open world games, not for heavy instancing. The engine was adapted to efficiently create, run, and destroy these temporary instances for small groups. Likewise, the general dungeon architecture in DDO would be far more detailed than AC2. Things like traps, indoor lighting, verticality, spot and search, and much more. Second, they had to build a real-time action combat system. Keep in mind that having such a combat system for a AAA MMORPG was unheard of at the time. Asheron's Call was known to have active combat, but even then, it was nowhere near what Turbine was planning for DDO. AC's combat involved tab targeting, and then player input to determine each attack's power, something like a charging system. DDO would require an active player's input for every swing, every spell, and every other action, which would also depend on the player's positioning and the enemy's hitbox, and things like aiming, dodging, and blocking. And lastly, they would adapt the engine to incorporate D&D's core mechanics, things like saves, D20 rolling, armor class, dodge chance, and much more. Achieving these three things would take most of 2004 and prove to be a major undertaking. On the content side, Turbine had chosen Eberron as DDO's world. It was a very new campaign for Wizards of the Coast, featuring a chaotic, ruthless world right after the end of a 100-year war. It featured a sort of magic meets steampunk style, with many crime detective stories, political factions, early 20th century technology, and other real-world themes. And there was no clear good versus evil, instead focusing on the bad consequences of fighting for righteous causes, something that DDO explored consistently in future storylines. Eberron provided D&D with a fresh, modern feeling after years of focusing on high fantasy, and Wizards of the Coast had very high ambitions for it, hoping it would one day become as popular as classics like The Forgotten Realms or Dragonlance. While it was never explicitly mentioned that Wizards of the Coast pushed Turbine to base their game on Eberron instead of a more established setting, it definitely seems interesting that they made this decision right in the middle of Wizards heavily marketing Eberron as their new poster child setting. But of course, we may never know the truth. The only thing we know is that this would be Turbine's setting for DDO. Of course, the team first had to create the foundations. They spent the first half of 2004 creating the first assets in the game: monsters, test locations, weapons, races, and classes. What you are seeing right now are the first DDO screenshots ever published online, almost 2 years before release. A lot of what you are seeing is already very familiar to what DDO looks like today, although maybe a bit rougher around the edges, since the DDO engine wasn't fully finished just yet. But the overall atmosphere was definitely darker, grittier, and more claustrophobic than the game at launch. The only thing that was clear is that Turbine was building the game very quickly. By late summer, Turbine had prepared DDO's first playable demo. Only 8 months into development, Turbine had to meet with the biggest games industry journalists and let them test run DDO. And so, the first DDO videos were published online for the world to see. These are those videos. The first video is titled Exploring Stormreach. What you are seeing right now is the original Stormreach marketplace, serving as one of the only 2 public locations in the game at the time. DDO players will immediately recognize how primitive this location was compared to the marketplace we have today. One journalist wrote, "The market was largely Middle Eastern in flavor, with lots of tented vendor stands, ornate plazas replete with fountains and plants, and light, blocky buildings modeled in a convincing style. This location was scrapped very early into development and never made it into the game." Second video is titled Running, Fighting, Running, and it features just that. It will again be very clear to everyone watching just how early stage the game was back then. The UI was practically non-existent, there is no minimap, no quest details or objectives, you basically have no idea where you are, and you don't even know your character's name. All we know is we're in some dungeon fighting some kobolds. This is the first time the public would get a glimpse of DDO's action combat system, with WASD keys and active aiming, something that was later scrapped as we'll learn soon. Turbine continued with their press roadshow for most of August, sitting down with Stratix, GameSpy, GameSpot, 1UP, IGN, and many others. The reception was very positive, and it genuinely seemed like the industry was very excited to see DDO come to life. Taking advantage of the momentum, Turbine ramped up their hiring very quickly. They changed their logo, they launched their website in September where they introduced the different developers, they opened the forums for the first time, they started making community content like blog posts, and made huge progress designing the game, with some of the earliest concept art being replaced for more final plans of what the game would really look like. The game also received its first name, which was Dungeons & Dragons: Secrets of Eberron. And by the end of September of 2004, DDO would also get its first ever trailer. Here it is. As you can see, the first trailer featured the same two public locations that were drafted, the Stormreach Marketplace and the Stormreach Harbor, along with test dungeons and much of the same action-driven combat that we had seen in the demo. DDO players will realize how different the gameplay looks from the game we have today. If anything, it resembles more like an action RPG like the Dark Souls games, rather than DDO. Turbine was determined to make the most fast-paced, active combat MMORPG ever. And so it begs the question, what happened that made Turbine change its mind? What made them change their course? Well, in late 2004, something happened that changed the gaming industry forever. Now, it's impossible for me to make this documentary without mentioning the unbelievable success that was World of Warcraft when it released. Just to put things into perspective, at the time, it was not just the most successful MMORPG, it was the fastest-selling PC game ever, even surpassing legendary titles like Half-Life, GTA San Andreas, Halo, and Diablo 2. It surpassed EverQuest's peak subscriber count of 500,000 only weeks after release, and later went on to achieve 12 million subscribers, something that was unimaginable for an MMORPG. With World of Warcraft's unprecedented success, the MMORPG genre transformed from a small niche into a mainstream billion-dollar industry. The landscape was scorched and remade in an instant. Studios around the world were reconsidering their own projects. Their internal projections suddenly rendered worthless. WoW's debut shattered the previous commercial ceiling, proving that the true audience for an online RPG was not thousands, but millions. The true potential of the MMORPG was much bigger than anyone expected. It was just a matter of making the right game. For Turbine, already under pressure to deliver a successful game very quickly, the temperature in the room went from warm to scalding. Their game, DDO, was set to launch into a market dominated by a giant, much bigger than EverQuest ever was. The demands from stakeholders were immediate. Atari, facing its own collapse, desperately needed Turbine to deliver a smash hit. They were not interested in a small success. They needed a massive revenue engine to stay afloat. To them, DDO was no longer a small, irrelevant piece of their game's portfolio. It became a lifeline. Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast needed a game that was extremely polished and palatable for the masses, ensuring DDO didn't scare away the new audience that WoW had proven was willing to play a game like this. The message to Turbine was brutally simple. We want more. Survival meant competing on the scale WoW had established. A game that would have been considered a home run 2 years prior was now commercially obsolete. Suddenly, achieving 50,000 subscribers was no longer considered a successful game. Turbine began the necessary and painful work of adjusting their plans to meet the new demands of the market. They sat down and analyzed what exactly made World of Warcraft so popular. Can they take any lessons for DDO? The number one reason was accessibility. WoW successfully transformed what was once a complex and unforgiving genre of games into one of the most intuitive games of all time. WoW immediately and irrevocably validated the theme park MMORPG model, and it took decades for AAA online sandbox games to begin to flourish after it. Turbine modified their game in three main ways to adjust to the times. First, they turned DDO's gameplay from a challenging pure action combat system with precision, reactions, and WASD keys into a hybrid system, where players could also have a typical tab targeting gameplay. Keep in mind that back in 2004, it was extremely rare for MMORPGs to have such an active combat system for a variety of reasons, mostly difficulty and server performance. In the end, Turbine yielded. They did not want to take such a risk, and they adjusted their gameplay before alpha. Second, it was clear after World of Warcraft's launch that vast open worlds were here to stay. Turns out, players enjoy being part of a huge world they can explore and lose themselves in. Turbine would have to introduce some sort of open landscapes. They would have to introduce wilderness areas, where players could earn XP by killing monsters, helping NPCs, and killing rare bosses, much like in typical MMOs. And lastly, World of Warcraft proved that making engaging content for solo players was equally important to making it for groups, something that went completely against Turbine's vision for DDO, since they wanted to stay loyal to the D&D pen and paper game, which was all about small groups of players collaborating with each other. In very early interviews of DDO, Turbine developers said that there will be solo content in DDO, but it will not grant experience. But by the end of 2004, it was said to press that there will be ways for solo players to enjoy the content without having to wait for a group. These features would be, number 1, hirelings, aka bots that you can buy from a vendor and bring to adventures with you. And number 2, diverse difficulty settings, allowing for solo players to get through 90% of the content in the game without having to wait a group. This may seem like a lot of changes, but in reality, Turbine stayed true to their cause. They did not steer away from their core vision of an action-packed, instanced MMO made for small groups of players under D&D rules. But like every MMO game studio of the time, they also wanted to share some of the success that WoW had. And so they simply made the game more accessible to the masses. And so, by the end of the year, the MMORPG genre had changed faster than Turbine could have ever imagined. What used to be ambitious was now simply not enough. The era of the niche MMO was over, and Turbine was about to compete in the major leagues. Turbine wasted no time. In January of 2005, DDO received its first producer letter. In it, they laid out their plans for the year. No more concepts, no more theorizing. This was the year they would once and for all launch DDO. Executive producer Judith Hoffman explained that DDO would go into non-stop testing and iterating until the game's release in September. There would be 4 testing phases. First, a beta 0, with a focus on making sure the most fundamental systems are working, For example, basic server configurations, setup of the game, and just making sure DDO actually runs. Participants for this beta would be a few selected, very experienced testers and referrals from Turbine's own employees. Then, there would be a larger Beta 1, focusing on basic gameplay at large scale, making sure that core mechanics are working, things like combat, running dungeons, and leveling. This is where developers would focus most of the iterations based on the community's feedback. Then, there would be a Beta 2, focusing on polish and bringing the game to the next level, stress testing things like grouping, chatting, guilds, LFMs, and more. By the end of this beta, the game should be somewhat close to shippable quality. And lastly, a Beta 3, focusing on showing the game to the world and making sure everything ties together. Shortly after, they officially changed their name from Turbine Entertainment Software to just Turbine, highlighting that they were no longer just a developer studio for hire, they were a powerhouse with publishing rights about to launch their next flagship. In April, Turbine officially opened registrations for their upcoming public alpha and beta, initially only allowing long-standing forum members to apply. People who would make a forum account just to save their spot in the alpha would be disqualified. What Turbine didn't expect was the huge participation from forum members, where almost 100% of members applied to alpha test. And so, only 3 days later, they decided to open applications to everyone. The testing applications soared to over 150,000, proving the huge expectations from the public on DDO. The enormous demand put even more pressure on Turbine, not only to launch on time, but to launch right. With expectations mounting, Turbine headed to E3 2005. This wasn't just the world's largest video game convention, it was the ultimate stress test. Before any public alpha, the world's harshest critics, journalists, and industry rivals would play DDO. For Turbine, it was yet another high-stakes gamble. Prove DDO could survive the shadow of World of Warcraft, who would be showing their game at the same convention, or be dismissed before the first alpha invite was even sent. Turbine staff got on a plane to Los Angeles, and on the way, released their pre-E3 trailer, showing the game at a much more polished state than it was 1 year prior. Here it is. And with that, on May 18, 2005, E3 began. DDO was shown to the world by lead designer Ken Troop and executive producer Judith Hoffman, both previous heavyweight developers at Asheron's Call.
We find ourselves at the Atari booth, which is just right across the hall from the GameSpot booth. How you doing? I got Ken Troop here. How you doing, Ken?
Good. How are you?
Good to see you. Pretty good. So you got a game over here that a lot of people are talking about, Dungeons and Dragons Online. How's it going?
Oh, it's going great. We're really excited about it. Really a great online RPG, allowing people to create custom D&D characters, go in the game, go on authentic, classic D&D adventures with their friends, and have a lot of fun.
The city is your social hub. This is the city of Stormreach, which is on the edge of an extremely dangerous continent that used to be inhabited by giants called called Vendrick. So it's fairly safe in the city, but once you start adventuring outside the city, yeah, it's going to be a lot more challenging for you.
Yeah. What kind of classes are available?
There are 9 classes that release and 5 races. We're doing all of the sort of what we consider the iconic D&D classes, with the exception of the druid and the monk.
Exploring the city, part of the game is kind of feeling in the city. One of the unique things about Dungeons and Dragons Online is that the city spaces are the main public shared spaces of the world, right? So when you go into these adventure spaces, those are all instanced or copied just for you and your party. Basically, the D&D analog would be that all of us were sitting around a tabletop playing D&D, and random strangers were coming along, throwing around your dice, ripping up your character sheets. That's not a lot of fun, and that's what the typical MMP situation can be today. So we wanted to make sure that when you go into the dungeon and you're with your friends, that it's really this private playground meant for you and your friends alone. So that's what D&D Online provides you, is that kind of your sanctuary to go on your private adventures and have the fun time that you guys want to have.
When's this game coming out?
We're shooting for Holiday 05.
Holiday 05.
Rock on, man. Thank you so much. Really nice to meet you. When can we look for Dungeons & Dragons Online to be coming out?
Dungeons & Dragons Online is scheduled to ship Q4 2005.
Right on.
All of this might seem obvious to a modern audience. Back then, DDO's systems were not the norm for MMORPGs. For Turbine, the gamble had paid off. They hadn't just survived the shadow of World of Warcraft. They had carved out their own light. The press was sold on the active combat, the visuals were ahead of their time, and the private dungeon model was being recognized as something truly unique in the MMO scene. As the team flew back from Los Angeles to Boston, the mood wasn't just relief, it was triumph. They had a winning build, they had a hungry audience, and most importantly, they had a release date. And in just a few weeks, real players would get to test DDO for the first time. In August, DDO's closed alpha began, the first time Turbine received feedback from real players. This wasn't a scale test. Access was limited, participation was controlled, and NDAs were enforced. The goal was clarity, to see whether the principles of DDO actually held together when players began pushing against them. Players logged in, and immediately, something important became clear. The core idea worked. Fans also loved the depth and polish of dungeons, and how different it felt from other games of the time. With a small group of 6 people, each dungeon felt like a different adventure, with traps, optionals, secrets, even a human narrator in every single quest, with D&D's creator himself, Gary Gygax, voicing one of DDO's storylines, Dalera's Tomb. Testers wrote, "I love the spot and search mechanism. The way that secret doors and traps light up is awesome. I like playing through the instanced quests much more than standard MMORPG hunting." Dice rolls were visible. Skill checks mattered. For the first time, D&D mechanics were performed in front of the player in ways no other online game had attempted before. I like that it shows dice rolls, helps keep the P&P feel alive. This was validation. The most radical parts of DDO, instancing, handcrafted quests, tabletop rules, were exactly the things pulling players in. But as testers continued to play, different feedback emerged about what this game actually was. Combat became the first fault line. Not because it was broken, nor because it was boring, but because it felt undecided. The real-time action combat felt fast, but chaotic. The result was a system that felt action-heavy on the surface, while still being governed by hidden tabletop math, a hybrid that left players confused. Testers wrote, "Combat really needs slowing down. It feels way too in between too fast and too slow. It's chaotic, much tougher to manage the battle, so it feels very actiony. It feels too frenetic and clicky as it is now, more NWN/Diablo than P&P Dungeons & Dragons. Players couldn't tell what kind of mastery the game was asking of them. Was this game about slow, patient dungeon crawling, or about speed and reflex? They weren't rejecting the combat, they were asking what language it spoke. That same uncertainty surfaced in class identity. My wizard was in melee combat way too much. The only solid way I can see to solo level a wizard is crossbow/bow and constant run and shoot. Even progression was unbalanced. Turbine had already scrapped the idea of 25 levels at launch. With only 10 levels planned, every level should have felt monumental. But instead, players advanced constantly without any meaningful reward. Progression existed, but it didn't feel great. The time it takes to get from level 1 to level 2 is way too long. MMORPG 101, they always screw you on EXP gains. The mini-dings, aka action points, are going to be a hard sell. Content design raised the same question. Instancing solved immersion problems that plagued other MMOs. No kill stealing, no spawn camping, no farm spots, no 50 players sprinting through a story beat. Players loved it. But instancing also clarified something else. Quests weren't part of the game. They were the game. Right now, quests are the only content in DDO. Thus, once you run out of quests, you're out of game. They were absolutely right. At this point, DDOs didn't have PvP battlegrounds, action houses, crafting, or any other similar system present in other games. Despite all the useful criticism, one refrain kept appearing. Overall, in my honest opinion, even in its alpha state, it's fun. Overall, I think it is reasonably fun, and seems to be pointed in the right direction. Still had fun though, so don't read this as a complaint so much as what I would consider ways to improve. That combination, enjoyment paired with uncertainty, was the most important signal Turbine received. The alpha proved the game worked, but players were not sure what Turbine's vision was, and after World of Warcraft, MMORPGs had to be intuitive over anything else, difficult to balance with such complex systems like D&Ds, a balance that DDO struggles with even today. Turbine developer Calandrel said, "It's easy for us to understand because we're so close to the game, but seeing it from someone else's perspective is extremely helpful. If we don't make it clear to players before they purchase, and people log in expecting a typical MMOG experience, we're setting them up for disappointment." The alpha finished, and internally, the realization set in. The testing had not revealed a game that needed fixing. Actually, there were not many bugs mentioned by players. It revealed a game that needed identity. What kind of game is DDO? By late summer, the conclusion was unavoidable. DDO was not ready. Not for launch. They could not meet their deadline. They needed more time. Jeffrey knew exactly what this meant. The alpha had given its verdict. DDO needed more time. Jeffrey knew better than anyone what launching early looked like. He had lived through it. He was not going to do it again. He was only one person who could give him that time, and that conversation wasn't going to be easy. In 2005, Atari was a company in serious trouble. Mounting losses, missed targets, a stock in free fall. They had bet heavily on a strong Q4. DDO was a significant part of that bet. Jeffrey flew to New York, knowing that the company sitting across from him needed this launch as badly as he needed to delay it. There is no public record of what was said in that room. What happened after tells you everything. August 11th, 2005. Armageddon Day for Atari. They had published their quarterly financials. They had missed their revenue target by 80%, revealing a total loss of $33 million, their worst quarter in history. In a single day, Atari's stock price plummeted by 40%. Later, on the same day, Turbine announced that DDO was being pushed to 2006, offering no explanation for the delay. Players were disappointed, but the real tragedy was about to come. 2 weeks later, the final blow landed. Turbine announced that Acheron's Call 2 would be shut down at the end of the year. Turbine executives explained that no matter how much they tried, they could not manage to increase the subscriber count for AC2, and after their recent expansion failed, the final decision was made. It was mentioned that no layoffs were made, and all resources were reassigned to other projects. The postponement was a turning point. After Turbine received more time, they returned home with a single mission: make Dungeons & Dragons Online worthy of its name. The stakes could not have been higher. Every developer in the company was on the same goal: one game, one sprint, one chance. Over the latter half of 2005, the team went into what would unofficially be known internally as All Hands on DDO. Developers who had worked on other titles were shifted to Stormreach. Artists, engineers, designers, everyone was repurposed into pushing DDO past its identity struggles and into clarity. The core ambition was to take the feedback from Alpha and turn it into a game people could finally understand and love. Turbine's Alpha had revealed that players genuinely enjoyed exploring instance dungeons. They liked how dice rolls and tabletop mechanics were visible, and they were excited by the idea of a D&D online world that felt unlike anything before it. Yet, it also showed something deeper. The game wasn't intuitive enough. This became Turbine's North Star. First came clarity. Combat was rebuilt to be readable and intentional. Animations were shortened, wind-ups removed, movement penalties reinforced. Every hit, miss, and modifier was surfaced through extremely detailed combat logs. Not hidden, but explained. DDO would never be simple, but it would no longer be opaque. Enemies became smarter and less exploitable. Monsters tracked players better and moved much faster, and bosses resisted charm, fear, poison, and instant kills. Back then, you used to be able to sit on a perch spot and spam instant kills on raid bosses until the spell landed. Then came fairness. Every dungeon in the game, over 100 at the time, was reviewed one by one. Length, density, traps, puzzles, story weight. Experience rewards were recalibrated across the board. And when a quest paid out too quickly, Turbine didn't just lower the reward, they made the dungeon harder. Finally came reliability. They made sure every system worked. Chat servers, storage, guilds, party and raid logic, voice chat, fixed every incompletable dungeon, reworked complex optionals, and overall just made sure the game held together when played by real players. At the same time, Turbine locked in major international deals. DDO was going global. Turbine chose Codemasters to run DDO in Europe, known for games like Worms, Arklord, and Dirt. DDO would also launch regionally across Asia. In China, they would launch through Shanda, publisher of Ragnarok Online and MapleStory. In Japan, through Sakura Internet, a large internet service provider, and in Korea through Let's Game, a small game studio known for PC room games. By the end of 2005, Turbine had finished the sprint. The foundations were finally there. Systems aligned. The game made sense. DDO was ready for public beta, its final test. But the year did not end gently, and there were no celebrations. On the last day of December, Acheron's Call 2 went dark. Whatever happened next would decide whether it had all been for nothing. In January 2006, all NDAs were lifted and public beta began. This time, it was about scale. Thousands of players flooding Stormreach at once. The core systems Turbine had rebuilt during the delay held. The confusion of Alpha was largely gone. Players understood what DDO was asking of them. They knew how to read the combat log. They understood why a hit landed, why a save failed, why a trap killed them. The game was no longer opaque. More importantly, it worked. Quests completed reliably. Servers stayed up. Chat functioned. Voice chat ran live inside dungeons. Boss fights felt challenging. Dungeons felt truly handcrafted. Everything tied together. Turbine had come a long way, and DDO was clearly close to the finish line. The beta also brought up two problems with DDO that Turbine tried to fix before launch, but they were not aware that, despite their greatest efforts, they would fail. These problems would remain with DDO even today, 20 years later. First of all, what DDO players call zerging. Remember, unlike in other games, in DDO, you get experience when you finish a quest, not every time you kill an enemy. This makes it so that players are incentivized to rush through every single objective in the quest, killing as little as possible, get the XP reward, restart, and repeat. Turbine developers admitted that players were finishing the content about 5 times faster than they expected, sometimes even more. Turbine tried to slow players down. During beta, they significantly increased XP gains on optional objectives, introduced major XP multipliers for killing more monsters, getting traps, smashing breakables, and years later, they would introduce Dungeon Alert, literally crippling players for dragging too many monsters without killing them, and many other things. However, none of this would truly stop players from zerging. Unfortunately for Turbine, this was not a bug they could patch. It was a fundamental side effect to the way they designed the game. Second, the stress test created real performance issues in the game for the first time. Players noticed server lag spikes during combat, especially when fighting multiple monsters, as the game would not be able to keep track of all the back-end combat calculations and create desync and crashes. Public zones were not fully optimized and would get players stuck, something that Turbine tried to alleviate by putting a cap on the amount of players that could be in a specific area and creating additional instances when that cap was reached. Unfortunately, here again, this was only the tip of the iceberg, and server lag would be one of the game's main issues throughout its entire history, even today. Despite these two things, the public beta was very successful. Jeffrey Anderson announced that by this time, a staggering 300,000 people had registered just to test the game. Few weeks later, Atari and Turbine announced that DDO had gone gold, meaning its initial development was complete, and the first DDO CDs were being shipped to retailers all over the world. 16 American servers were announced, and 7 more in Europe. And so, by the end of February, Turbine had survived the sprint. Against all odds, they had finally finished building their game. For the first time in 3 years, the keyboards at Turbine's office went silent. It was all set. In a matter of hours, the entire world would get to play DDO, and Turbine would finally find out if any of it was enough. After 3 years of near bankruptcy, a hostile publisher, a troubled alpha, a forced delay, and the shutdown of its predecessor, Dungeons & Dragons Online went live on February 28, 2006. No one at Turbine knew what they had actually built. To them, they had just shipped a game. And for the players logging in that day, it was just something new to try. But it didn't end. What they had created and what those players had stepped into kept going, far longer than anyone in that moment could have imagined. Over the next 20 years, games would come and go, and DDO stood strong. For some, it was just a game they tried once and moved on. For others, it became something harder to explain, a place they returned to for years, a community they never quite left, a world that watched them grow up and grew with them in return.